The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, as hundreds of tourists gathered for one of London's most famous attractions. Among them stood a figure as still as stone, dressed in the iconic red tunic and towering black bearskin hat that had become symbols of British tradition. Sergeant William Thompson had been standing guard at this very spot for over an hour. Not once had he moved a muscle, not when a tourist waved frantically in front of his face, not when children made funny faces trying to make him smile, not even when someone accidentally bumped into his polished black boots. This was his job, and he took it more seriously than anything else in his life. William had dreamed of becoming a Queen's Guard since he was 8 years old. He remembered visiting London with his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had pointed at the guards and said, "Those men represent the very best of our country, William. They stand there with honor, protecting something much bigger than themselves." Now, 15 years later, William understood exactly what his grandfather meant. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of centuries of tradition on his shoulders. The red jacket wasn't just clothing, it was history. The bearskin hat wasn't just headwear. It was a symbol of duty that stretched back generations. The rules were simple but absolute. No talking to tourists, no moving unless it was part of the ceremony, no breaking character, no matter what happened around him. These weren't just guidelines, they were sacred laws that every guard swore to uphold. William had seen colleagues get dismissed for far less serious breaches. One guard had been removed from duty simply for winking at a child. Another had lost his position for adjusting his hat when it wasn't the proper time. The standards were impossibly high, and that's exactly how William liked it. It meant something to be here. It meant he was part of something special. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement. Camera flashes went off constantly as tourists tried to capture the perfect photo with the motionless guard. Children pressed their faces against the palace railings, pointing and whispering about the toy soldier man who never moved. Adults debated whether the guards were real people or incredibly detailed statues. William had heard it all before. After 15 years, the comments and attempts to get his attention had become background noise. He had trained his mind to focus on his duty while filtering out everything else. His eyes scanned the crowd methodically, watching for any potential threats or disturbances, but his face remained expressionless. The morning shift was always the busiest. Tour groups arrived by the dozen, each guide explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. William listened to the same stories told in different languages, each guide adding their own colorful details about the Guard's training and dedication. Some stories were true. Yes, they trained for months to achieve this level of discipline. Yes, they could stand motionless for hours at a time. Yes, they took their duty incredibly seriously. But some stories were myths. No, they couldn't be arrested for moving. No, they weren't allowed to use the bathroom only at specific times. And no, they didn't have to stay silent if there was a real emergency. But William preferred that tourists believed in the mystique. It made his job feel more important, more meaningful. When people looked at him, they weren't just seeing a man in a costume. They were seeing a living piece of British history. As the morning wore on, the crowd grew thicker. School groups arrived, their young voices adding to the symphony of sounds that surrounded the palace gates. William's trained peripheral vision caught sight of parents lifting children onto their shoulders for better views, couples taking selfies, and elderly visitors sharing stories of their own memories of royal ceremonies. This was London at its finest, a mixing pot of cultures and ages, all united by fascination with tradition and pageantry. William felt proud to be at the center of it all, a silent guardian of something that brought joy to millions of visitors each year. His feet had stopped aching hours ago. His back had adjusted to the perfect posture required. His mind had settled into the meditative state that allowed him to remain alert while appearing completely still. This was more than a job. It was a calling that demanded everything he had to give. The palace behind him stood as a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Just as the building had weathered centuries of change, the guards represented values that remained constant: duty, honor, service, and sacrifice. William understood that his role was to be a living bridge between the past and present, showing everyone who saw him that some things were still sacred. Little did he know that in just a few short minutes, everything he believed about duty and protocol would be tested in a way he never could have imagined. 7-year-old Lily had been clutching her mother's hand tightly when the crowd suddenly surged forward. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and everyone wanted the best view possible. In that moment of chaos, as hundreds of people pushed and moved around them, something terrible happened. Her small hand slipped away from her mother's grip. At first, Lily wasn't worried. Her mother had to be right there somewhere. She looked up, expecting to see the familiar face and warm smile that always made everything okay. Instead, she saw a forest of legs, coats, and bags. Adults towered over her like giants, all focused on getting their cameras ready for the ceremony that was about to start. "Mummy?" she called out, her voice small and uncertain, but her words were swallowed by the excited chatter of the crowd and the sound of marching boots echoing across the courtyard. Lily tried to push through the people around her, but she was too small. Every step she took seemed to lead her further away from where she thought her family should be. The faces around her were all strangers, some speaking languages she didn't understand, others too busy taking photos to notice a frightened little girl. Her heart started beating faster. This wasn't like the time she got lost in the grocery store, where she could still hear her mother's voice calling her name. This place was huge, with stone walls that seemed to stretch up to the sky and more people than she had ever seen in one place. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. The toy had been with her since she was 3 years old, a constant companion that helped her feel brave during thunderstorms and doctor visits. Right now she needed that bravery more than ever, but even her beloved rabbit couldn't make the scary feeling in her stomach go away. She tried standing on her tiptoes to see over the crowd, but everyone around her was so much taller. All she could see were backs and shoulders and handbags. The sound of drums and military music was getting louder, which meant more people were gathering to watch the ceremony. With each passing minute, the crowd grew thicker, and the chance of finding her family seemed to get smaller. "Excuse me," she said to a woman standing nearby, tugging gently on the woman's coat, but the woman was busy adjusting her camera and didn't hear her. Lily tried again with a man holding a guidebook, but he was deep in conversation with his friend about the best angle to photograph the guards. The fear that had started as a small knot in her stomach was growing bigger and stronger. Her breathing became quick and shallow. Hot tears started forming in her eyes, making everything around her look blurry and even more confusing. She remembered what her parents had taught her about being lost. "Find a policeman or someone in uniform," they had said. "They're there to help people." But in this sea of tourists, she couldn't spot anyone who looked like they could help her. The only uniforms she could see were the red-coated guards standing perfectly still like statues. The ceremony music grew louder, and suddenly, everyone around her started moving again. The crowd shifted and swayed as people tried to get better positions to watch the marching soldiers. Lily found herself being accidentally pushed and bumped by people who didn't even see her down at their knee level. That's when the tears really started flowing. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was terrified. In her young mind, she began to imagine that she might never see her parents again. What if they had left without her? What if she was stuck here forever among all these strangers? She tried calling out louder, "Mommy, Daddy!" But her voice cracked with emotion, and the sound barely carried beyond the people immediately around her. A few tourists glanced down at her with mild curiosity, but they quickly returned their attention to the spectacle they had come to see. Lily's legs felt shaky, and she sat down on the cold cobblestones, not caring that her pretty dress was getting dirty. She hugged her stuffed rabbit as tightly as she could, and cried the kind of tears that only come when a child feels completely alone in the world. The irony was cruel. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, all enjoying a beautiful day in one of the world's most famous places. Yet she had never felt more isolated. The laughter and excited conversations around her only made her feel more invisible. As the ceremony continued and the crowd grew more animated, Lily's sobs became harder to control. She was hyperventilating now, struggling to catch her breath between tears. The overwhelming noise, the press of strangers, and the complete absence of any familiar face had pushed her young mind to its breaking point. She didn't know that just a few feet away. A man in a red uniform and tall black hat was watching her with growing concern, fighting an internal battle between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the human instinct to help a child in distress. William's training had taught him to see everything without appearing to look at anything. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision caught every movement in the crowd around him. It was this skill that first made him aware of the small figure in the light blue dress, who seemed to be moving frantically through the sea of tourists. At first, he assumed she was just another excited child, perhaps playing a game with her parents or trying to get a better view of the ceremony. Children often darted around during these events, and their parents usually kept a close eye on them. But something about this little girl's movement seemed different. Less playful, more desperate. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify potential threats or problems, maintain awareness without breaking position. These were the habits that had been drilled into him until they became second nature. What he saw made his chest tighten with concern. The child was alone. Completely alone. And she was scared. William had been a father himself once. His own daughter would have been about the same age as this little girl if things had been different. The memory was painful, but it had never left him completely. He recognized the body language of a frightened child, the way she clutched her toy, the frantic turning of her head as she searched for familiar faces, the increasing desperation in her movements. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to help her. The father in him wanted to step down from his post, kneel beside her and ask where her parents were. The protector in him wanted to use his radio to alert security immediately. The human being in him wanted to do something, anything to ease the terror he could see growing in her small frame. But the soldier in him held him in place. 15 years of perfect service. 15 years of never breaking protocol. 15 years of understanding that his personal feelings must never interfere with his duty. The rules were clear and they existed for good reasons. If every guard started abandoning their posts whenever they saw something that concerned them, the entire system would break down. He tried to convince himself that someone else would help her. Surely one of the hundreds of tourists around her would notice a crying child and take action. Surely her parents were nearby and would find her any moment. Surely this situation would resolve itself without requiring him to compromise his oath of duty. But as the minutes ticked by, his hope faded. The tourists were all focused on the ceremony, their cameras and phones raised to capture the perfect shot of the changing guard. They were seeing what they came to see, experiencing the moment they had traveled from around the world to witness. A small child sitting on the ground didn't fit into their picture of the day. William watched in growing anguish as the little girl's distress escalated. Her quiet sniffles had become audible sobs. Her careful searching had become frantic spinning in circles. Her composed posture had collapsed into the defeated slump of a child who had given up hope. His hands, trained to remain perfectly still at his sides, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The internal conflict was tearing him apart. Every fiber of his being that made him a decent human being was at war with every principle that made him a good soldier. He thought about his commanding officers, who had drilled into him the absolute importance of maintaining protocol. A guard who broke ranks for personal reasons, no matter how well-intentioned, was a guard who couldn't be trusted. The reputation of the entire unit depended on each individual's ability to follow orders without question. But he also thought about what his grandfather would have said. The same grandfather who had inspired him to join the Queen's Guard had also taught him that a man's character was defined by what he did when no one was watching, or in this case, when everyone was watching, but no one understood the true cost of his decision. The ceremony around him continued with military precision. His fellow guards maintained their positions with the same unwavering discipline they had shown thousands of times before. The crowd cheered and applauded at all the right moments. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should, everything except for one small girl whose world was falling apart just a few feet away from him. William closed his eyes. For just a fraction of a second, a breach of protocol, so minor that no one would notice, but significant enough to represent his internal struggle. In that brief moment, he made a decision that would change everything. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer just a Queen's Guard following orders. He was a human being who had chosen compassion over compliance, love over law, and humanity over hierarchy. The consequences of what he was about to do could end his career, damage his reputation, and disappoint everyone who had believed in him. But as he looked at that frightened little girl, he realized that some things mattered more than his own future. Some things mattered more than rules. The breaking point came when Lily's breathing became so rapid and shallow that William could see she was starting to panic. Her small chest was rising and falling too quickly, and her face was turning red from crying and struggling to catch her breath. This wasn't just a lost child anymore. This was a medical emergency waiting to happen. In that split second, time seemed to slow down for William. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out the ceremonial music and the chatter of the crowd. 15 years of training told him to stay in position. 15 years of perfect service record told him to trust that someone else would handle the situation. 15 years of following orders without question told him that breaking protocol was never acceptable, no matter the circumstances. But 35 years of being human told him something different entirely. He thought about all the reasons he shouldn't move. His commanding officer's stern face flashed in his mind, along with the memory of countless lectures about maintaining discipline under all circumstances. He thought about the other guards who would witness his breach of protocol and how it might affect their own commitment to the rules. He thought about the tourists who expected to see an unmoving, stoic figure representing centuries of British military tradition. Most of all, he thought about his career. This job wasn't just work for him, it was his identity. Being a Queen's Guard had given his life meaning and purpose after he had lost so much. The uniform represented everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, everything he was proud of about himself. But then he looked at Lily again, and all of those concerns suddenly seemed small and selfish. The little girl had stopped looking around for her parents. She had stopped calling out for help. She was just sitting there on the cold stone, hugging her stuffed rabbit and struggling to breathe through her tears. She had reached that terrible moment that every parent dreads, the moment when a child gives up hope. William's mind flashed to his own daughter, the one he had lost in a car accident 5 years earlier. He remembered how she used to get scared during thunderstorms, how she would run to him for comfort, how he would hold her close and promise that everything would be okay. He remembered thinking that being her father was the most important job he would ever have. That memory made his decision for him. The first movement was the hardest. His left foot, which had been planted firmly in position for over an hour, shifted slightly forward. It was such a small action, but it felt like moving a mountain. Every muscle in his body had been trained to resist exactly this kind of impulse. But once he started moving, something remarkable happened. The weight of protocol that had been pressing down on his shoulders for 15 years suddenly lifted. In its place came a sense of purpose that was cleaner and clearer than anything he had felt in years. He was no longer Sergeant William Thompson of Her Majesty's Guard. He was no longer a symbol of military discipline and royal tradition. He was no longer a man following orders that had been written by people who had never faced this exact situation. He was simply a human being who saw another human being in trouble, and he was going to help. The crowd began to notice his movement almost immediately. Gasps and whispers spread through the tourists like ripples in a pond. Phones and cameras that had been focused on the ceremony suddenly swung around to capture this unprecedented moment. People stopped talking to their companions and started pointing at the guard, who was breaking every rule they thought they knew about his job. William could feel the eyes of his fellow guards on him. He could sense their confusion, their concern, and perhaps their judgment, but he didn't turn to look at them. His focus was entirely on the little girl who needed help, and nothing else mattered. As he took his second step away from his post, William felt both the weight of his decision and the lightness of finally doing what his heart had been telling him to do. There would be consequences, serious ones, but for the first time in years, he was completely certain that he was doing the right thing. The ceremony continued around them, but for William and Lily, the rest of the world had faded away. This was their moment, a moment when duty to humanity trumped duty to protocol, when compassion proved stronger than regulation, when one man's courage to break the rules created space for something beautiful to happen. He was about to lose everything he had worked for his entire adult life, and he had never felt more sure of himself. The moment William's polished black boots touched the cobblestones away from his designated position, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. It was as if they were witnessing something impossible, like seeing a statue come to life or watching gravity suddenly work in reverse. For many of the tourists, this was their first time seeing the Queen's Guard, and they had been told these men never moved except during the official ceremony. Some visitors actually rubbed their eyes, wondering if they were seeing things correctly. Others immediately reached for their phones, instinctively knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. William moved with the same measured precision he used during official ceremonies, but now there was gentleness in his actions. Each step was deliberate and calm, designed not to startle the frightened child who was still struggling to catch her breath on the ground just a few feet away. When he reached Lily, he slowly removed his towering bearskin hat, something that protocol dictated should only happen at very specific times and places. The hat had always made him feel official and important, but right now it was just creating a barrier between him and someone who needed help. With his hat tucked carefully under his arm, William knelt down on the cold stone beside the little girl. The action brought him down to her eye level, transforming him from an intimidating giant in a red uniform into someone who felt safe and approachable. "Hello there, little one," he said softly, his voice carrying the warm accent of his Yorkshire childhood. It was the first time in over an hour that he had spoken, and the first time in 15 years that he had addressed a member of the public while on duty. Lily looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, too shocked to immediately respond. This tall man in the bright red coat had seemed like part of the building itself just moments ago. Now he was talking to her in the kind of gentle voice that reminded her of her grandfather. "My name is William," he continued, speaking slowly and clearly so she could understand every word. "I can see that you're scared and I want to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The kindness in his voice and the genuine concern in his eyes began to work their magic. Lily's rapid breathing started to slow down just a little bit. "Lily," she whispered, still clutching her stuffed rabbit against her chest. "That's a beautiful name," William said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "And who is this fine fellow you're holding?" He gestured gently toward her toy. "This is Benny," she said, her voice still shaky but growing a bit stronger. "He's my rabbit." "Well, Benny looks like a very brave rabbit indeed," William replied seriously. "I bet he's been taking good care of you today. Now, Lily, can you tell me where your mummy and daddy are?" The question brought fresh tears to her eyes, but they weren't the panic-stricken tears of before. These were the tears of relief that come when a child realizes that a grown-up is finally going to help make things better. "I don't know," she said, hiccuping slightly. "We were watching the soldiers and then everyone started moving and I couldn't find them anywhere." William nodded understandingly while quietly reaching for his radio. His fellow guards and supervising officers would already know something was happening. His movement away from his post would have been reported immediately. But rather than waiting for questions or reprimands, he needed to focus on getting help for this child. "Security, this is Post 7, he said into his radio, using his official call sign. "I have a lost child, approximately 7 years old. Blonde hair, blue dress. She's been separated from her parents during the ceremony. Can you please alert all units and check with the family assistance point?" The response crackled back immediately. "Post 7, confirm you have left your position?" William looked at Lily, who was watching him with growing hope in her eyes, and then at the crowd of tourists who had formed a circle around them, all staring in amazement at this unprecedented scene. "Confirmed," he replied firmly. "I have a child in distress and I am providing assistance." There was a pause on the radio, and William could imagine the confusion and concern in the security control room. Then came the response. "Understood, Post 7. Family assistance is en route to your location." While they waited, William continued talking to Lily, asking her about her trip to London, her favorite things about the palace, and whether she had enjoyed seeing the horses. Each question helped distract her from her fear and allowed her breathing to return to normal. The crowd around them had grown larger, but it had also grown quieter. People who had been chattering excitedly about the ceremony were now watching in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing something much more important than any military pageantry. Many of them were parents themselves, and they could see their own children in Lily's frightened face. They could imagine how they would feel if their child was lost and scared in a foreign place. Most importantly, they could recognize the extraordinary kindness in William's decision to abandon everything he was supposed to do in order to help someone who needed him. What had started as a breach of military protocol had become something much more profound, a reminder that behind every uniform, every title, and every set of rules, there is a human heart capable of making choices based on love rather than law. As they waited for security to locate Lily's parents, William found himself in completely uncharted territory. For 15 years, his interactions with the public had been limited to ceremonial nods and the occasional, "Yes, sir," or "No, ma'am," when directly addressed during official functions. Now here he was, having a real conversation with the 7-year-old girl, and discovering that it felt more natural than anything he had done in years. "Tell me about Benny," he said, settling more comfortably on the cobblestones beside her. "How long have you two been best friends?" Lily's grip on her stuffed rabbit loosened slightly as she began to feel safer. "Since I was little," she said, unconsciously echoing what every child says when describing anything that happened more than a year ago. "Daddy got him for me when I had to go to the hospital for my tonsils." "Ah, so Benny is a medical rabbit," William said with mock seriousness. "That's very special indeed. I bet he's seen you through all sorts of adventures." For the first time since becoming lost, Lily smiled just a little. "He comes everywhere with me. Mummy says he's getting too old and raggedy, but I told her that just means he's full of love." The simple wisdom of her words hit William unexpectedly hard. Here was a child who understood something that adults often forgot, that the value of something isn't measured by how new or perfect it looks, but by how much love it holds. Around them, the crowd continued to grow, but it had taken on a different quality. Instead of the boisterous energy of tourists trying to get the best photos, there was now a reverent quiet, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something sacred. Parents pulled their own children closer, perhaps thinking about how easily this could happen to any family. William noticed an elderly woman wiping tears from her eyes as she watched him talking gently to Lily. A young father was filming the scene on his phone, but he lowered the device when he saw how personal and intimate the moment had become. Even the other tourist who couldn't speak English seemed to understand the universal language of compassion that was unfolding before them. "Have you been to London before, Lily?" William asked, continuing to keep her distracted from her worry. She shook her head. "This is my first time. We came on the train from Scotland. It took forever, but Daddy said it would be an adventure." Her lower lip trembled slightly as she mentioned her father. "Scotland," William exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "That's where some of the finest soldiers in the world come from. Did you know that some of the guards here at the palace are Scottish too?" This seemed to interest her greatly. "Really? Do they wear the same red coats?" "They do indeed, and some of them wear kilts during special ceremonies." "Perhaps your daddy was a soldier once?" Lily nodded proudly. "He was in the army before I was born. He says soldiers look after people who can't look after themselves." The innocence of her statement struck William with unexpected force. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. Here was a child who understood the true purpose of military service better than many adults, not to follow rules blindly, but to protect those who needed protection. As if summoned by her words, his radio crackled to life again. "Post 7, we have located the parents. They are with family assistance and heading to your location now. ETA 2 minutes. William felt a mixture of relief and something else he couldn't quite identify. Relief because this little girl would soon be back with her family where she belonged, but also a strange sadness that this extraordinary moment was about to end. "Lily, I have wonderful news," he said, his voice warm with genuine happiness. "They've found your mummy and daddy, and they're coming to get you right now." Her face lit up with joy so pure and bright that it seemed to illuminate the entire courtyard. "Really? They're really coming?" "Really and truly," William confirmed. "They'll be here in just a moment." As they waited for the reunion, Lily did something completely unexpected. She scooted closer to William and, without asking permission, leaned against his red-coated arm. It was such a simple gesture, but it represented complete trust from a child who had been terrified just minutes earlier. William felt his throat tighten with emotion. When was the last time someone had trusted him so completely? When was the last time he had been able to offer comfort instead of just standing as a symbol? When was the last time he had felt this useful, this needed, this human? The crowd around them seemed to sense the poignancy of the moment. Several people were openly crying now, moved by this display of pure kindness between strangers. Others were smiling with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something beautiful and unexpected in a world that often seems harsh and impersonal. In that quiet moment, with a small child leaning trustfully against his arm, William realized something profound. He had spent 15 years trying to be the perfect soldier, following every rule and regulation to the letter. But he had never felt more like the man he was meant to be than he did right now, kneeling on the cold ground with his hat in one hand and his other arm protecting a frightened child. This was what service really meant. This was what it meant to be a guardian. The sound of running footsteps on cobblestones cut through the quiet atmosphere that had settled over the crowd. William looked up to see two figures pushing through the circle of tourists, a woman with blonde hair like Lily's, and a tall man in a navy jacket, both of them looking frantic with worry and hope. "Mummy." "Daddy?" Lily's cry of recognition was like music cutting through the tension that had gripped everyone for the past 20 minutes. She scrambled to her feet, still clutching Benny the rabbit, and ran toward her parents with the kind of speed that only children can manage when they spot safety after being scared. Her mother dropped to her knees on the hard stones, not caring about her dress or the hundreds of strangers watching, and swept her daughter into her arms. "Oh, sweetheart. We were so worried," her mother whispered, her voice breaking with relief and residual fear. "We looked everywhere for you. We thought... She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone watching knew what she had been thinking. Lily's father stood over them both, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on his family. William could see the military bearing in the man's posture, the straight shoulders, the controlled movements, the way he constantly scanned the environment even in this moment of joy. Once a soldier, always a soldier. As the immediate reunion settled into quieter hugs and whispered reassurances, Lily suddenly remembered the kind man who had helped her. She turned in her mother's arms and pointed toward William, who was still kneeling on the ground a few feet away. "That's the nice soldier man who helped me," she announced proudly. "His name is William, and he talked to me about Benny in Scotland and made me feel not scared anymore." Both parents looked at William with expressions of amazement and gratitude. The father stepped forward first, and William rose to his feet, instinctively straightening to attention despite the unusual circumstances. "Sir," the father said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm Robert, and this is my wife Janet. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." William started to respond with the formal, measured words he might use during an official function, but then he stopped. This wasn't an official function. This was just one human being thanking another for doing what was right. Any parent would have done the same thing, William said simply. "She's a remarkable little girl. You should be very proud." Robert's eyes filled with tears he was trying hard to control. As a former soldier himself, he understood exactly what William had sacrificed in this moment. He knew about military discipline, about following orders, about the consequences of breaking protocol. He also knew that what William had done went far beyond the call of duty. "I served too," Robert said quietly so only William could hear. 10th Regiment Royal Engineers. "I know what this cost you, and I know why you did it anyway." The two men looked at each other with the understanding that passes between people who have worn the uniform and sworn the oath. Then, to the amazement of everyone watching, Robert stepped back and gave William a crisp military salute. It was a gesture of respect from one soldier to another, recognizing not just William's rank or position, but his character and his sacrifice. The crowd, many of whom didn't understand the military significance of the moment, nonetheless felt the power of it and began to applaud. The applause started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but it quickly spread through the entire gathering. Soon hundreds of tourists from dozens of countries were applauding together, united by their recognition of something beautiful and brave. Some were clapping because they were parents themselves, and could imagine their gratitude if their child had been helped this way. Others were clapping because they recognized kindness when they saw it regardless of the circumstances. Still others were clapping because they had witnessed something that reminded them that rules and regulations, while important, should never completely override human compassion. Janet stood up, still holding Lily, and approached William with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing her. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being the kind of person who would risk everything for a child you'd never met." William felt overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. In 15 years of military service, he had received commendations and awards, but none of them had meant as much to him as these simple words from a grateful mother. Lily, secure now in her mother's arms but still watching William with adoration, suddenly had an idea. She whispered something to her mother, who smiled and nodded. "Lily wants to give you something," Janet said. stepping closer to William. The little girl reached out and pressed her beloved stuffed rabbit into William's hands. "I want you to have Benny," she said seriously, "so you can remember that you're a hero." William looked down at the well-worn toy, this rabbit that had been her constant companion, her source of comfort through frightening times, her most precious possession. The gift was so pure and generous that he could barely speak. "Lily, I couldn't possibly," he began. But she interrupted him with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "Benny likes heroes," she said firmly, "and you're the biggest hero I know." The crowd's applause grew even louder as people realized what they were witnessing. Phones and cameras captured the moment from every angle, but for once, the technology seemed secondary to the human story unfolding before them. William carefully accepted the precious gift, holding the small rabbit with the same reverence he would show to a military medal. In that moment, surrounded by applause and gratitude with a child's most treasured possession in his hands, he realized that he had just experienced the most important moment of his entire career. The weeks that followed William's decision to help Lily would prove to be unlike anything he could have imagined. What he thought might be the end of his career instead became the beginning of something much larger and more meaningful than he had ever expected. The video footage from that day spread across social media platforms faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours, millions of people around the world were watching the moment when duty met compassion, when protocol gave way to humanity, when one man's choice to break the rules reminded everyone what really mattered. The comments poured in from everywhere, mothers thanking him for showing what true strength looks like, fathers expressing their admiration for his courage, children drawing pictures of guards helping other children, former military personnel sharing their own stories of times when they had to choose between regulations and doing what was right. But perhaps the most surprising response came from within the military itself. Instead of facing disciplinary action, William found himself called to a meeting with his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, a stern man who had never been known for his flexibility regarding protocol. "Sergeant Thompson," the colonel had said, gesturing for William to sit across from his desk. "I've been in this job for 30 years, and I've never had to deal with anything quite like this before." William braced himself for the consequences he knew he deserved. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his position, and no matter how good his intentions had been, actions had consequences in the military. "Sir, I take full responsibility for my breach of protocol," William began, but Colonel Harrison held up his hand to stop him. "Let me tell you what I've learned this week, Sergeant," the colonel continued. "I've had calls from the Prime Minister's office commending your actions. I've had letters from military families around the world thanking you for showing their children what honor really means. I've had requests from charities asking you to be their spokesperson for child safety initiatives." William sat in stunned silence as his commanding officer continued. "More importantly, I've had time to think about why we wear this uniform. Is it to follow rules perfectly? Or is it to serve and protect people who need our help? What you did that day reminded all of us, including me, what our real mission is supposed to be." The colonel stood up and walked around his desk to face William directly. "The Queen's Guard exists to protect what matters most about this country. And what matters most isn't buildings or ceremonies or traditions, it's people. Especially children who need help. Rather than punishment, William received a commendation for exceptional service in the protection of vulnerable civilians. The citation would become part of military training materials, used to teach future guards about the balance between discipline and humanity. The story took on a life of its own beyond the military world. Lily's family had stayed in touch, sending regular photos and updates about her life back in Scotland. She had started school, and proudly told everyone about her friend William, the hero guard who had helped her when she was scared. Every few months, a package would arrive at the palace addressed to Sergeant William Thompson, the kind guard. Inside would be drawings from Lily, photos of family trips, and updates on how Benny the rabbit was settling into his new life in William's small apartment near the barracks. The rabbit had become something of a mascot in the guards' quarters. Other soldiers would often ask about Benny's day when they saw William returning from his shifts. The stuffed animal served as a daily reminder that behind every uniform was a person with a heart, and that sometimes the most important orders came not from commanding officers, but from conscience. William's story had also inspired changes in protocol that would benefit future guards. New guidelines were established for situations involving children in distress, giving guards more flexibility to provide assistance while maintaining their ceremonial duties. Training programs began, including scenarios about balancing duty with humanitarian response. Most remarkably, the incident had created a new tradition. Children visiting the palace began bringing small gifts for the guards, drawings, letters, and sometimes even their own stuffed animals to share. While the guards couldn't break position to accept these gifts during ceremonies, a special collection point was established where families could leave tokens of appreciation. A year later, William was selected to participate in a documentary about modern military service. During his interview, he was asked if he regretted his decision to leave his post that day. "I spent 15 years learning how to be the perfect soldier," he replied, holding Benny in his hands as he spoke. "But it took a 7-year-old girl to teach me how to be a complete human being. The rules we follow are important, but they should never make us forget why we're following them in the first place." The interviewer pressed further. "Do you think other guards should break protocol when they feel it's necessary?" William considered the question carefully. "I think every person, whether they're wearing a uniform or not, has a responsibility to help when someone truly needs help. The difficult part is knowing the difference between wanting to help and needing to help. That day with Lily, there was no question in my mind. She needed help, and I was the only person positioned to give it to her." As the documentary aired and William's story reached even more people around the world, it became clear that what had happened that day had touched something universal in human nature. In a world that often seemed divided by differences of opinion, culture, and belief, here was a story that everyone could understand and appreciate. The final scene of the documentary showed William back at his post, standing with the same military bearing and discipline he had always shown. But now, visitors to the palace looked at him and all the guards with different eyes. They saw not just symbols of tradition, but real people capable of extraordinary kindness. And sometimes, when a child in the crowd looked scared or lost, other tourists would point toward the guards and say, "Don't worry, they're there to help people. They're heroes." The ripple effects of one man's moment of compassion continued to spread, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that could never be fully measured. William had thought he was simply helping one frightened child, but in reality, he had reminded the entire world that the greatest strength lies not in following rules perfectly, but in knowing when love matters more than law. In his small apartment that night, as he did every evening, William would look at Benny the rabbit sitting on his shelf and remember the little girl who had taught him the most important lesson of his life. That being a hero isn't about wearing a uniform or following orders. It's about being brave enough to do what's right, even when it costs you everything you think you have to lose.